Hello, class. Wanted to discuss Chapter 9, which is about reasonably accommodating disability and religion. This has a lot of personal meaning for me because most of my job, or at least a lot of my job, I work with individuals with disabilities in my full-time job. And if any of our employees feel like they've been discriminated against based on their disability, my office is the one who usually works with them. So again, I do get quite a few concerns and questions about a disability, to a lesser extent religion. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, but definitely on disability. So a couple things that I want you to know for Chapter 9. First off is, what is the ADA? The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 obviously prevents employers from discriminating against an employee based on either them having an ability or a disability or a perceived disability. We'll get to that in a second. So, and your book talks about kind of like the three parts of a disability. So important to know those three parts, but again, I wouldn't necessarily test you on those three parts. But one thing that I do want you to pay very close attention to is actual disability. So, and there's kind of three elements that make up actual disability. First off is there a physical or mental impairment? So, a broken leg, some type of mental disorder, anything that you can that a doctor can diagnose, any type of physical or mental impairments, those are actual disabilities. Anything that affects, that's number one. Number two is anything that affects a major life function. So, if you're unable to walk or talk or see, or, any major life activity that, that somebody without a disability would be able to kind of just do naturally, that is something that would be perceived as or having a disability that affects a major life activity. And the third is it substantially limited? So, if you're unable to walk or you're unable to do, are you substantially limited in doing other activities? So, if you go blind and then you can't hear very well, or, anything that substantially limits, your ability to conduct major, number two, major life activities. So those are the three elements of an actual disability, and those are all protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In addition to that, perceived disability is also protected. So if you if you come to work for an employer and for 6 months, for whatever reason, they think you have cancer, for example, and then they treat you differently when they find out you don't have cancer, they thought all along you were perceived as having a disability. If they're wrong, that's still protected. They still can't come back and discriminate against you because they made a mistake, because they thought you had a disability, but you actually didn't. So make sure you understand the idea behind perceived disability, because that's also protected under the ADA. And whenever we're analyzing these types of things, there's really the major question that we look at is, can the employee perform the essential functions of the job? And that's why, a good job description, is so critical, because when we're looking at, ADA accommodations, can the person perform the essential functions of the job? So if you're a cook, for example, can you, spice the food? Can you, work the grill? Can you, get stuff out of the refrigerator? These are the essential functions of being a cook. So as long as you can perform the essential functions, the employers have to accommodate you with that. Now, but what happens if they, if let's just say you're in that same example where you're a cook, let's say you can't work the grill, or you can't, reach up and grab, the ingredients that you need, or you can't open a refrigerator. So all those, so how far does an employer have to go to create what we call a reasonable accommodation for you? Page 334 of your textbook lists 7 examples of reasonable accommodations. This will definitely be a test question, so make sure you fully understand what makes an accommodation reasonable. Again, those are 7 examples that you can go by, and my exam question will be kind of related to one of those 7. So, but make sure you understand, what is considered reasonable, and by the same token, what makes it unreasonable. Usually, what we call an undue hardship. What makes it hard for an employee? So, for example, if an employee, says, well, I need an accommodation and I need this piece of equipment that's going to cost $300,000. Obviously, that's probably a little too much money for a standard company to be able to accommodate. The cost, for example, would be an undue hardship on the employer. So if it's costly, if it requires extensive, change, or if it's disruptive to kind of the normal interactions. Again, your book does kind of talk about, some of those undue hardships specifically. So make sure you pay careful attention to those. And again, on page 336, take it a step further, there's a list of what makes an accommodation reasonable. So make sure you pay very close attention to those details, because those are the types of questions that you will see on an exam related to reasonable accommodation. And again, what makes this part so critical is because this will follow you your entire career. No matter what field you go into, reasonable accommodations and helping employees with either actual disabilities or perceived disabilities will be something that you will have to work with. So it is something, it's good to know the law, what the ADA does and does not cover. Those are kind of the main things that I want you to know under Chapter 9, under disability, excuse me. Under religion, so the other part of the chapter, page 354 lists the elements of a claim for failure to reasonably accommodate religion. So, make sure you pay careful attention to what would you have to show to, failure to reasonably accommodate religion. And in my career, having worked in kind of this equity field, I would say whenever I've been presented with a case where somebody is claiming religious discrimination, it's generally kind of falls in one of two areas. The first area is kind of, they weren't given days off to pray or certain days off to go to church. So if your job requires you to work on Sunday and somebody says, well, I can't work on Sunday, because of my religion, I need to go to church on Sunday. How much we have to or don't have to accommodate is a big part of that discussion. So, days off for, to observe religious services, that's one thing. Other thing that I see pretty often is things like facial hair. A lot of companies have policies where you need to be clean shaven, or you can't really have like long excessive beards, or can't have like multicolored hair, for example. And that's more for for customer service purposes. But some religions require you to have a long beard, or maybe even have color in your hair. So when I did a summer internship when I was in law school at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I remember those were probably the most common cases that I saw when it comes to a failure to accommodate religion. And again, an employer can have a multitude of reasons for why they do or don't condemn, but make sure you understand what somebody would have to show for failure to accommodate a religious claim. Again, those examples that I use are just two examples. Now, your book also does talk about that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which we've talked about earlier in the semester, has a religious organization exemption. Yeah, so for example, which basically kind of means you can more or less discriminate based on religion. So, for example, if you work for a Catholic organization, and they can basically make being a Catholic part of the requirements to work for them. So if you are Jewish or Muslim or even Protestant Christian, they can have a policy where you have to adhere to the tenements of the Catholic faith to be able to work for them, because they are a religious organization. Now, of course, like anything, there's a multitude of exceptions and details. So make sure that you understand, based on what's stated in your book, about religious organization exemptions, because that might be a test question too, about when would an organization be required, could they it would be legal for them to provide an exemption on religious grounds. So again, I love these two topics. I could sit and talk about them forever and ever and provide you multiple examples, but again, I don't want to bore you too much. So those are the main highlights of chapter 9 that I want you to know about reasonably accommodating disability and religion. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks, class.